Luke chapter 2. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for him in the inn. So the scene here, a little over 2,000 years ago, Mary and Joseph had to go from Nazareth, Galilee. That's up here on the northern part of Israel. The cities of Nazareth and Galilee. That's where his family, that's where Joseph and Mary lived. But Joseph was originally, his family was from down in Bethlehem. And that's more toward the south part of Israel. That's down below Samaria. So it was a little bit of a journey. Might have taken them a few weeks to get there. I'm not sure exactly how long. But they didn't have cars and planes and buses and trucks back then. Most people walked wherever they went, or they would have rode a donkey or a camel if they could afford something more luxurious through those terrains, rugged terrains, and what have you. So it would have taken a while. It would have been a bit of a journey. They went because of the decree from Caesar Augustus. This is kind of an amazing thing to me, because Caesar Augustus was the emperor of the Roman Empire. He was over 1,000 miles away, all the way over in Rome. He'd probably never heard of this coming Messiah, this Christ who was born to be King of all nations. He'd never even considered such a thing. They were worshiping false gods and idols, and I'm certain, didn't even believe in them. They were just legends and fairy tales to keep the people occupied. This Caesar Augustus, when he decided to issue this decree to all the world, all the known world, to be taxed or to be registered, this census, he wasn't thinking about getting Joseph and Mary to have to go down to Bethlehem. Didn't enter into his thinking. Yet, it had been decided thousands of years before he was born that this is precisely what he would do at this time. God had laid out this plan from the foundation of the world that his son, Jesus, would come to be born in Bethlehem. And this was just a small part of all of the intricate details that God put together in order to get him there. It had been decided, like I said, for centuries. Every detail of this plan, every single detail was known to God before Caesar Augustus was ever born, before Mary and Joseph were ever born, before you were ever born, before ever the first star was put in its place. God knew how this plan was going to all play out. And so he chose to use this emperor, this Caesar Augustus guy. He chose to use him as a very major and strategic part of this plan, even though this emperor didn't believe in him. You know, God can use you whether you believe in him or not. I tell people this, I've told people this many times throughout my ministry. I have told people for many years that your life will bring glory to God. I've heard a lot of people say, why don't you use your life to glory God, to honor God instead of dishonor him? But really, you don't have a choice. Your life will bring honor and glory to God. We'll talk about that a little more as we go. Even people who have chosen not to honor God, when you look at their lives through history, like Pharaoh, king of Egypt, like Augustus here, like King Cyrus, like Nebuchadnezzar. If you look back at history, even people who chose to do the exact opposite of what God told them to do, when you look at the history of their lives, it brought honor and glory to God. Your life will bring honor and glory to God either because you are an object of His great mercy and reward and love and rejoicing, or because you are an example of His divine wrath and His divine power and His divine consequence. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So, as we go, maybe. Anyway, this isn't the first time that God chose to do this either. In Isaiah chapter 45, God talks about a guy named King Cyrus. And he prophesied, and he said, this is what Cyrus will do, even though he does not know me. That was 150 years before Cyrus had even been born, yet God called him by name. And Cyrus, of course, was the emperor, the king of the Persian Empire that would overthrow Babylon and would rule the world for some time before Alexander the Great came along. And again, hundreds of years before he was born, the book of Daniel tells us about Alexander the Great and the things that he would do. So this isn't the first time that God has decided to use people who didn't even believe in Him, who didn't even acknowledge His existence, to do things that He had planned from before the foundation of the world. It delights God to show His power through people who don't even believe in Him. It delights Him, it honors Him, it glorifies Him. In fact, when Moses was talking to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, when Moses said, let my people go, and Pharaoh said, I don't know your God, and I don't have to do what you say or what your God says. Moses told Pharaoh, he said, I want you to understand, in very deed, for this cause has God raised you up, for to show in you His power. The whole reason that Pharaoh was even on the throne was so that God could be glorified in breaking him. So it pleases God. So think about this for a minute. Think about all the people that had part in God's amazing plan for Jesus Christ to be born in Bethlehem. It wasn't just Caesar Augustus. You know, there was a lot of folks. There was a lot of folks that had part in this amazing plan. There was Mary, of course, the virgin, who would bring forth a son. This virgin teenage girl had never yet been with a man, suddenly found to be with child. There was Joseph, this honorable man who was looking forward to being married to this beautiful young lady. There were the shepherds who were in the field that night when the angels came. There were the angels. There were the innkeepers at the inn that didn't have room for them. I imagine there were a good many people on the caravan. They probably didn't travel by themselves. They probably traveled with some other people down from Galilee. I imagine there were some people along the way, some food service workers, some other travelers whose paths they would have crossed. There was Anna, the elderly lady there at the temple when they brought Jesus in to dedicate him. So many more people that weren't even named that somehow played a role in this story of Mary and Joseph coming down from Galilee to Bethlehem to be in the right place at the right time for the right event that they thought was just happenstance but was really planned. Every single one of them had a role to play in God's amazing plan. The innkeepers, think about them. They had a role to play in this plan that God had from the foundation of the world. Think about it. Caesar Augustus had his role. The shepherds that thought they were just out in the field by accident that night, but they had actually been planned to be there for so long so that they could come and worship him. The wise men. All of these. And I want you to know something. You have a role to play in God's plan today. God has a plan for the world today. God has a plan for your city today. God has a plan for this nation. He has a plan for your family. He has a plan for the things that are happening in the world today. None of it is by accident. In fact, I say this again and again and again, folks. Every time I pick up the Bible and I read and I look at the world around me, I'm not convinced, there's no disconnect between the Bible and the world I see today. The world I see today confirms the things that I read in the Bible. I see the events that are happening in the world today, even this coronavirus and the political events and the racial strife. All of the things that I see in the world are the things that the Bible said would be happening in the last days. All of the scientists who try to claim that there is no God. Someone told me once, and I've said this many times, that the church is dying. Look how many people don't go to church anymore. And sometimes when people go to church, they don't know how to behave when they get there. Yet, nevertheless, people say, well, the church is dying. I say, no, if you look in the Bible, it says that in the last days there will be a falling away from the faith. Jesus won't return until there first is a falling away. All of these things are fulfilling Scripture. So, you have a role to play. God has a plan for what's going on in the world today. And every single one of us here and every single one of you who are watching, you have a role to play in this plan for this time and for this place. You, right where you're sitting. Maybe you're a teacher. Maybe you're a mechanic. Maybe you're a student and you're still in school or in college. Maybe you're a cook. Maybe you're an executive. Maybe you're a volunteer or retired. Maybe you're unemployed looking for a job. But whatever your status, whatever your place, maybe you're a homeless person and you're watching a recording of this later. Maybe you're disabled. Whatever your status and place in life at this very moment, God has a role for you to play. He wants to use you where you are to accomplish His plans. So as we talk a little bit today, I want you to be mindful of this one thing. How can we be mindful of these heavenly things? We go through our lives, it's so easy to go through our lives without ever considering the heavenly things. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. There are unseen plans of God. You don't even know. Maybe you think you're by accident here today. But God may have planned for you to be here this very moment. You know, there was one event that happened in my life, just one event. And I tell you, it just seemed like it was chaos and happenstance, but it shaped the whole rest of my life. And then there was another one like that, and another one like that, and another one like that, and I've lost track of how many. How can you be mindful of these heavenly things yourself? What's your role in the lives of people around you right now? Right this very minute, what's your role? What does God have you here to do? What does God have you in Springfield, Ohio to do if you're watching here in Springfield? If you're here in this church today, why are you here? What does God have you here for? Is He setting you up for a great and glorious testimony of His power working through you? Or are you here to be an example of one of them who ignored the word, who ignored the gift when it was offered to you? There were a whole lot of people in Jerusalem that Jesus wept over because He said, I wanted so much to give you something so good, but you didn't recognize it. But you know, they still glorified God because they're part of that testimony that He offered it. Is that your role? What's your role in the lives of the people in your school or your job, this ministry, this community? We should be mindful of that. So let's talk a little more about their journey down to Bethlehem. You know, Mary and Joseph probably didn't have an easy way to go. It was probably a difficult journey, probably real hard. It was probably a lot harder than they thought it would be. Could you imagine being pregnant? I can't really imagine being pregnant. Most of us guys here can't really imagine that. Yeah. I can't really imagine that. I can imagine having to be with a pregnant woman, though. while you're traveling on foot, on horseback or donkey back. Oh my goodness. Traveling all the way for weeks at a time. The wind blowing, sometimes raining. Cold at night, hot in the day. I bet it was a lot harder than they thought it would be. And the truth is, things probably did not go at all the way they planned. They probably had a way different plan for how it was going to go. I'm sure that things couldn't possibly have gone the way they planned, because what kind of a man would take his pregnant wife on a journey expecting her to have to give birth out in the stables with the dirty old animals? I'm pretty sure they planned on sleeping in the inn when they got there. I don't know, maybe they planned on getting there earlier before the inn was all filled up. Maybe they got held up on the travel, you know? Maybe the journey cost more than they thought it was going to cost, and they had to stop and get some more funds. Maybe they got delayed by the weather. Maybe the weather was a lot harder. Maybe it took a lot longer for Mary to travel. Maybe there were some issues with her being pregnant that slowed them down, and so they didn't get there till all the hotel space was gone. Life happens, people. Things don't always go the way we planned, and sometimes you may find yourself in a situation that you didn't intend to be in. Hardship comes to us that we didn't plan for sometimes. Sometimes it's our own fault. A lot of times it's our own fault. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's somebody else's fault. But it doesn't really matter whose fault it is. Life happens. And here Mary and Joseph were. I'm pretty sure that no matter what, they didn't plan on sleeping on the street. I'm pretty sure they didn't have to plan on having to sleep there with the animals. They would have had no way of knowing that this was part of God's divine plan, though. They probably thought everything was going wrong. You ever been in a situation where you think everything just keeps going wrong? Nothing is going my way. I'm working so hard. I was praying. I was doing good, and nothing is going my way. I imagine that's what Joseph and Mary was thinking. You know, someone asked this question once when we were talking about Joseph back in Egypt, the other Joseph. And when he got thrown in the pit by his brothers, they said, do you think he cried out for God's help while he was in that pit? Of course he did. You think he felt like God wasn't listening? I don't know, he might have. But it was all part of God's divine plan for his life. It was all part of the setup for his come up. Maybe you're going through something right now. Maybe you're not in the best situation in the world. Maybe you're wondering, has God forgotten me? Did God not have something as good for me as everybody else? Or maybe he's got something better. Whatever God has for you, it is exactly perfect for you if you'll receive it. I'm sure Mary and Joseph thought everything was going wrong. And now the worst thing of all happened. She's having the baby. And we're out here with these dirty animals. Probably smells like doo-doo. Here we are. How could God let this happen to me? They might have thought. And how many times have you been in a situation? Maybe you haven't been in that situation. I hope not. But how many times have you been in that situation where you're saying, if God loved me, why would this be happening to me? If God really loved me, why is my family going through what we're going through right now? Maybe there's no God. Maybe he just doesn't care. People think these kind of things, but listen, the Son of God himself was born in a manger. And it was part of God's divine plan. Don't let hardship discourage you, my friends. God is not unrighteous to forget your works or your labors of love. The Bible tells us he won't forget the good things that you do. Yeah, they thought everything was going wrong. You ever been through something that was hard? You ever been through something that was hard, but when it was over, you wouldn't trade the experience for the world? Hey, I'll tell you what, I've been through a few things that were really, really hard, but when I came out on top, I'll tell you what, I wouldn't go through those things again for anything. But if you could go back and undo it, I wouldn't trade that experience for the world. Some of those hard experiences are what made me who I am, making me who I am. I don't want to go through another one, but I'm glad for the ones that I've been through. So here they go. They get to this place, finally at Bethlehem, and there's no room for them at the inn. So let's talk about that inn just for a minute. Why do you suppose that God would allow Jesus to be born in a manger instead of a mansion? Don't you think that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, that the supreme leader of all creation for all eternity, the King of all angels and principalities and powers, the King of every world that exists beyond this world, don't you think he ought to be born in the most luxurious of what we have to offer? You know, when dignitaries come to our country, even dignitaries of third world nations, we put them up in the best of what we have to offer. We show them our very, very best. Why, they'll close the whole floor of hotels. Don't you think that God's own son ought to have been born in a mansion instead of a manger? So why do you suppose God allowed that to happen? Because he not only allowed it, he ordained it, my friends. Well, one reason is we have a perfect picture here of the rejection of Jesus. God's been rejected by men for a very long time. It's this rejection of God by men that led us into condemnation in the first place, that's condemned us to hell in the first place, that caused us to need a Savior in the first place. This rejection of God. John chapter 1 tells us how Jesus came into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, but the world did not receive him. Perfect picture of the rejection. There were plenty of room in the inn for other things. The Bible says there was no room for them in the inn. There was no room for Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus in the inn, but there was plenty of room in the inn, folks. There was an inn. There was an inn. I imagine there were room for business. There were plenty of business people that had all the room they needed. There was room for pleasure in the inn. I imagine there might have been some couples there for a rendezvous. A pleasant time. Some joy and fun. Some folks there vacationing. There was room for pleasure and there was room for business. There were plenty of room for other people in the inn. But when the time came, this exact time, this time that had been waited for from the beginning of the world, when the time came, there was no room for Jesus in the inn. I suppose there was a good many people, and by the way, have you made room for Jesus in your inn? Because we all have an inn inside of us. We all have a place inside of us for him. Listen, I suppose there was a good many people in that inn who would gladly have made whatever adjustments that they needed to make if they had just known who this pregnant lady was or who was about to be born. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if they had known that this was the Messiah that was being born? They would have said, take my room. Take my room. How fast can I clear out of the way? How many people would have gladly given up their space if they had just known? How many people would have been willing to share their sweets in order to provide space for Jesus to be born? If they had only known who it was. If they'd only known how important his role is to all humanity. Oh, how quick they would have got out of the way. So many of them would have adjusted their schedules, whatever it was that they had to do, however important it was. It could have waited. It could have got canceled. Maybe those important things become not important at all in comparison. Maybe some of that reserved space that was sitting there reserved for those people coming tomorrow could have been used today. Oh, how quick they would have made something available. But when they saw this pregnant woman, if they had just known that it was the Christ, surely they'd have found some way to make some room. They'd have knocked out a wall if they had to. This was a Jewish town, by the way. This was a religious town, and these were religious people. These were godly people. These were not heathen, barbarous people. They were religious people. So I'm sure that every single one of them, and I want you guys to watch it online, and some of you here, I want you to think about this for a second. I'm sure that every single one of those people didn't think they were doing anything wrong by not making room for Jesus in the end. It's not like they were sinning. It's not like it was their responsibility. They paid for their, what do you call that? They paid their rent. They paid for their room. They paid their bill. I'm sure they didn't think of themselves as ungodly for not finding a way to house this couple in need of shelter. I wonder how many people sat in comfort and watched Mary and Joseph go by as she was maybe grimacing in pain and thinking, oh, that poor couple, somebody ought to help them. Somebody ought to help them. How often have you seen someone in need as you're driving down the road or walking along the way and thought, oh, somebody ought to help them? I want to tell you that somebody is probably you. We'll get to that. How many of these people would have helped gladly if they'd just known who it was? But instead, they probably shook their heads thinking, what a pity. What a pity. Oh, she's going to have that baby out there in the animals. Hope he doesn't catch any coronavirus. Hope he doesn't get sick. Terrible place to have a baby. Hey, can you get me another warm drink? Have some of that bread. Well, I bet some people even took them some deodorant and toothpaste so they wouldn't smell bad while they was out there in the cold. That's what we do around here. I read that there was a homeless crisis here in Springfield, Ohio. 340 people homeless. 100 or so of them they've put up in inns, but 200 or so of them have no room. Well, have no room. But I did hear that a lot of leaders had got together and at least put together care packages of deodorant and hygiene products for them. Oh, by the way, the inn is closed, the IHN, the Interfaith Hospitality Network, our homeless shelter, the only one in the whole state that chose to close as a result of this coronavirus. So it's not just common to that time, but I suppose it's common to all times. It's easy to shake your head and say, somebody ought to help you. But here's some toothpaste. At least your mouth will taste good while your teeth are chattering. Okay, well, let's move on. Where was I? Yeah, maybe somebody offered them some deodorant or some hygiene products or something as they headed back comfortably to their home, to their inn, to their suite. And surely not one of them thought that they had done anything wrong. And yet Jesus had to be born in a manger. Jesus, our Lord, had to be sleeping in a manger. Mary, the mother of God, had to be out there in the cold on the night that Christ was born. But the innkeeper and all their staff and all the people around probably didn't do anything wrong. Surely no one thought that. And there are many people in our community right now who have no room in their inn, whatever their inn might be, not only for the homeless, not only for that, but how many other needs are there around us? How many other situations and opportunities to do good pass us by every day because it's not our responsibility? How often do we shake our head when we could extend our hand? Jesus said there is something wrong with that. Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, Jesus said this. He said, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, we're talking about the end of the world now, folks. We went all the way from the coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Because I was hungry, and you gave me some food. I was thirsty, and you gave me some drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? By the way, sick or in prison and come to you, not sick and run from you. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me get back to the text. And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly, not maybe, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. And then he will also say to those to his left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. Because I was hungry and you didn't give me any food, and I was thirsty and you didn't give me any drink. And I was a stranger and you wouldn't take me in. Sick and in prison and you wouldn't minister to me. And they'll say, when, Lord, did we ever see you in need and not give you what you needed? And he'll say, I'm telling you the truth, inasmuch as you did not do it to the least of these, my brethren, you did not do it to me. You see, they were responsible whether or not they knew it was Jesus. And so are we. I don't know what the story is behind every need. To me, this is one of the most sobering passages in the entire Bible. Because here, people are being judged. And they're being judged not for the sins that they've committed, but for the good that they've omitted. Let me say that again. People here are being judged not for the bad things that they did, but for the good things they failed to do. We who are strong must bear the infirmities of the weak. And Christmas is a wonderful time to be talking about that, but we should really be talking about it all the time. Those who are strong must bear the infirmities of the weak. Now, if I had no resources, then I have no obligation to use them for God. If it's in your power to do good and to do it not, I believe that's a sin. If you don't have the power to do good, well, then you're not expected. If I had no resources, then I got no obligation to use them. If I had no abilities, then I have no obligation to use my abilities for God. Tiffany was singing so beautifully this morning, like an angel. She's been given an ability and a gift. And how incredible it is that she so often uses that gift to glorify God. That's what we're supposed to do. Not all of us can sing, but we can all do something. I've never met anyone who doesn't have something. If I do have resources, talents, abilities to do good, if it is in my power to do good, and I choose not to, I'm going to have to give an account. And so will you. Consider again all those people that had a role to play in the birth of Jesus. Like I said, there was the innkeeper, there were the shepherds, there was Caesar Augustus, there was Mary, there was Joseph, there were so many more. They all had a role to play, but not all of their roles were honorable. First, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 20 says, in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and of silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for honor and some are for dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work. Like I said, Moses told Pharaoh, it was for this very reason that God raised you up, to show in you his power. We can choose whether we're a vessel fit for honor or for dishonor. You have a role to play, and you will play a role in God's eternal plan. God has an eternal plan for every man, woman, and child that has ever been born. There's a role that you will play in this story, but you can choose whether it's going to be a role of honor or of dishonor. We can be prepared for waste or prepared for every good work. Either way, the role we play will honor God. Do you want to be the person who was available to do God's will in this time, today? Do you want your story to be the story of the time when you heard God's Spirit speaking to you and he was asking you to do some great thing and receive some great thing and you answered it? Or do you want to be the story of the kids that were on their phone in church not paying attention to the word that was being preached when their blessings passed them by? Is that what you want to be? When the preacher was talking to you directly and you were too busy in your own little lost world? Which story will you be? Oh, what a shame. Oh, what a shame for those who missed it. Will you be the innkeeper that was too busy or too afraid or too distracted to have a place for Jesus? Or will you be like the shepherds who dropped everything and ran to worship him? Will you be one of the saints that brought the poor into your own house? Or will you be one of those who walked by the poor and the hungry and the homeless and did not have time to notice, never realizing that one of them was Jesus? Galatians chapter 6 verse 10 says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. We have an opportunity to do good here in this season. I touched on the homeless crisis in Springfield, Ohio here a minute ago. It's just only recently come to our attention that our shelter is closed here and there's so many people as we're moving into the winter on the streets. We have an opportunity to do good. It's not our responsibility. We don't have a command from the government. We don't have a grant from the government. All the money's going somewhere else, but there are people still not being taken care of. And the methods that are being used, by the way, to help the ones that are absolutely atrocious. I can't say enough bad about them. We'll talk about that another time. But even with that, so we could point the finger and we could talk about how all the people that ought to be doing something aren't. We could shake the head, or we could just open our door and prepare some food ourselves. We're going to choose to do that here. If you're watching online and you want to be part of that, I invite you to come and help. Come and help. The only thing stopping us, a couple weeks ago I was talking with some folks about this homeless crisis. And then I was on a call with 30 or so community leaders, pastors and government officials, people like myself. And we were talking about the crisis and the hundreds of people that are on the street and the fact that the homeless shelter is closed and there aren't enough rooms in the inn. We spent about an hour talking about how to at least get the people some deodorant and toothpaste and how we could pull together enough volunteers to put together some bags of these care packages. And I'm not against that idea, but it's so shallow. It's a shame that the city or the government even has to be involved in that at all. Do you know whose responsibility it is to take care of the poor and the homeless? It's the church. It's our responsibility. We're Christians. Somehow we think that we need Pharaoh's money. We don't. We think that we have to wait for the government to do everything. And so we'll take Jesus out of it, and we're willing to take Jesus out of it. We're willing to take the gospel out of it. We're willing to take righteousness and holiness out of it. We're willing to take everything out of it if we just don't have to do it ourselves. Folks, it's time to roll up your sleeves and do it yourself. We're Christians. Anyway, we were talking about this. We were having this this conversation, this Zoom meeting, and then I went out to dinner. Nice dinner in a very nice restaurant. I had this wonderful seafood, and it was delightful. Why? What I spent on that dinner, how many people could I feed here? Anyway, and then we got in the truck and we came home, and I stopped at this Speedway, and as I was going in to get me something to drink on the way home, there was this homeless guy sleeping there on the sidewalk, and a little bit of snow was starting to fly. Had a little duffel bag for a pillow. I don't run a homeless shelter. Never have. I usually refer people to one, but we don't have one. I walked on by and I got in my truck and I drove on, but I kept thinking about it. I got all this space here, right here in this church. We got extra rooms we're not using today. We got thousands of pounds of food available. I'm going to go home, sleep in my warm bed, eat my comfortable meal, and not be moved at all by what I've seen. And I thought, how would I explain that to Jesus? Now, we don't have any funding for that. I know the city's putting together a $10 million plan for other stuff to address this, but there's people cold right now. How am I going to explain that? It won't be politically correct or popular and step on some other people's toes. In fact, as soon as I started talking about the idea of Inside Out doing something, because I couldn't sleep that night, I decided we're going to do something. As soon as I started talking about it, people started voicing their concerns that we're competing with the other agency that's closed. We shouldn't think that we're better able. I don't think that we're better able to do it, by the way. What I said publicly, I'll say here, the only thing that makes me think we're better able to serve the 150 people left on the streets is the fact that we're willing to and they're not. Am I going too far? Okay, I'll stop with that. But anyway, what stopped me that night, though, was this one thing. It's a big undertaking and people have to come and help. Somebody's got to help supervise the building. Somebody's got to help with some organization. Somebody's got to help cook all this food that we've already got. And we live in this world where, even in ministry, generally if people lift a finger, they expect a dollar. Brothers, this ought not to be this way. I don't receive a salary. Neither does my wife. Neither do a lot of you all here that are helping. But generally, to fund anything big, you got to have a big staff. It wasn't that way in the first century church. I'm sure there's some people watching online right now that are going to want to come and volunteer. You can come here tonight. We're going to serve a meal. Show up around 6. And we're going to open the back up. And if anybody's cold and needs a place to sleep tonight, they can sleep here. And we'll see where it goes. And we'll see how many people like you that are watching might come. Because there is an opportunity to do good right now in this Christmas season. And it doesn't have to stop when Christmas is over. Maybe you're not able to take part in this. And by the way, it's going to take a lot of resources. It's going to take some beds and some blankets and some pillows. We're going to have to build some partitions and things like that. We're going to have to buy a lot of paper plates and napkins and forks and knives and spoons, things like that. There's all these logistics to think about. Masks and hand sanitizer, it all costs money. Maybe you've got some you could give. Or maybe you've got some funds to give. We've had some very generous people come forward and offer a good deal of support since we started talking about this. So we're just going to do it. We're going to see where it goes. We're going to see. And if you're thinking about this, so I want you to think about what other opportunities has God shown you to do good? This is one that's in front of us right now we cannot ignore, but it's certainly not the only need in our community. And there are probably needs in your circle of influence that I don't even know about. Maybe in your family, maybe in your school, your work, wherever you are, your circle, there are needs. And you have opportunities to do good. Every day will present you opportunities to do good. I promise you, every single one of us, if you're just awake and alert to them. But we tend to go through life, and so many of us, especially including Christians, we tend to try to look the other way. Or worse, since we're not going to do what we know needs done, we try to do some little trinket thing so we can say we did something. Like giving a thing of deodorant to a guy that's freezing to death in the cold. That's okay if that's all you can do, but it's not all we can do. My God, it's not all we can do. It's not even close to all we can do. It's not even the tip of the iceberg. If there wasn't such a thing as a building in this city that could be used for a homeless shelter, every single person who calls themselves a Christian ought to be willing to open their door to one person. No one. It's just not all we can do. And we shouldn't need the government's money or the government's interference. Anyway, I gotta get back to the word so I can close. We have opportunities to do good. What other opportunities has God shown you? So let's choose this Christmas time, this Christmas season. I'm closing on this note, folks. And I only went 8 minutes over. So I'm closing. Let's choose this Christmas season to be more like the shepherds who dropped everything. They were busy. They had jobs. But they heard good news. Not only for them, but for all the world, that Christ was one. They dropped everything to run and see this Jesus, to run and to worship Him, to serve Him. They dropped everything. So let's decide this Christmas season, I want to be more like them than I want to be like the innkeepers that had no room for Jesus that they're in. I don't want to be the innkeeper that has no room in my inn. I want to be the shepherd that's willing to drop everything. Not just once, but every time He calls. Drop everything and serve Him.